Help support the show by joining the Patreon or becoming a YouTube member. Also, hit that like button and subscribe if you want more Browns-focused content.
I've been getting an uneasy feeling about one thing with the Browns coaching search so far. And it's not what I think most people would have it be. I don't really have an issue with the list of people so far that they've interviewed and requested. I don't mind the fact that the Browns have taken their time with this process, and it seems like they're starting with guys who aren't the most experienced, but I think they're looking under every nook and cranny here for people they may or may not like. I don't mind that part of the approach. The one thing that makes me nervous, and look, maybe this is founded and this video ages like fine wine, maybe this is unfounded and this video ages like milk, but the one thing about this search that has me a bit uneasy is the John Harbaugh element of it. And let me be clear here. I don't think John Harbaugh is a bad coach. I don't think it's impossible for John Harbaugh to find success somewhere. And I don't even think it's impossible for him to find success in Cleveland. But the fascination with John this offseason for the Browns, I feel will ultimately be an issue for them in ultimately finding their answer at head coach if they aren't able to hire him. Because one, I don't know if this franchise is self-aware enough to know that they just aren't going to be natural favorites for John Harbaugh to take this job. I think the Browns can be easily sold on the idea that John wants to take this job, right? I don't think that's close to the reality. My fear is that John keeps the Browns in it until it gets to a point to make a decision, and then the Browns are out of it, right? And the reason he would keep the Browns in it is, one, it is a bit of a safety net position, right? The Browns will be willing to meet your contractual demands. They will be willing to give you the money that you feel like you should get in compensation. And the Browns, ultimately, they want you there. They have a good defense. If you were dead set on taking a job, but you couldn't get the job for whatever reason that you really wanted, the Cleveland job makes sense. Like, I view the Browns coaching search very similarly to the Penn State coaching search, right? And when that job came available, right, they fired James Franklin for all the reasons we knew James Franklin should be fired for in Penn State. Everybody went up in an uproar. Oh, how could you fire James Franklin? James Franklin's going to be this, right? But we knew why Penn State had to fire James Franklin. It's not that James Franklin was outright terrible. It's just that, there was a hump that Penn State couldn't get over with James Franklin, and it had become enough at that point in time. And Penn State, I thought they got a good hire at the end of the day, right? The Cleveland job is similar. And what I mean by it's similar to the Penn State job is the Cleveland job's not a terrible job. Just like the Penn State job is not a terrible job. The issue with the Cleveland job when it comes to trying to get a top candidate is this. If you're good enough to take the Cleveland job and you're a high profile candidate with a lot of leverage, you're probably good enough to take a job that has a quarterback or a path to a quarterback. Now, I think ultimately John Harbaugh's willingness to take the Cleveland job is going to be dependent on what he thinks of Cam Ward, what he thinks of Jackson Dart, what he thinks of the two quarterbacks at the top of this draft class, and even just the quarterback class in general. I don't imagine John has had a ton of time to catch up on this quarterback class, because I can't imagine that John spent most of the year doing much work on this quarterback class because I don't think he assumed he was going to get fired this season from the Baltimore Ravens. So I don't know where John's head is when it comes to this quarterback clash. But if he doesn't determine that, a team like Tennessee is closer to a quarterback than where Cleveland is because he's not a fan of Cam Ward, or if he determines that Jackson Dart and that's not going to be a path to a quarterback for him, then maybe I think Cleveland becomes a realistic option. But you're waiting for a lot of dominoes to fall if you're Cleveland. And you have to ask yourself, is John Harbaugh a chance at John Harbaugh, mind you, worth the opportunity cost that might hit you if you're the Cleveland Browns? I'll explain that in just a minute. But real quick, let me thank my sponsor, Sleeper. Hey, have you ever heard of the Sleeper app? Well, here's a fun secret. It's not just for fantasy leagues. It's great for fantasy leagues. I personally have used it for years with my college friends to play fantasy football and to do pick'em leagues, all sorts of fun stuff like that. But the Sleeper app also gives you news. It gives you scores. You can also try to turn your football knowledge into real money. Just download the Sleeper app and pick more or less on your favorite players with more stats than any other daily fantasy app. Just choose 2 or more of your favorite players from pregame or live. Pick more or less from the predicted stats, and you could win up to 100 times your money if your picks win. Use promo code WORSTTAKE and you'll get up to $100 match on your first deposit. Again, promo code WORSTTAKE. You'll get up to $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. Links are in the description. Okay, so John Harbaugh, he just announced his first interview. It was with the Atlanta Falcons. I think that is very, very interesting, but not for the reasons that are obvious when I say that. I think it's interesting that John Harbaugh happened to be in Atlanta this weekend of all weekends. It's pretty big coincidence, right? That John Harbaugh just so happens to be in Atlanta the week that the top 2 quarterbacks are going at it in Atlanta in the Peach Bowl in the college football playoff. I don't know if these two things are connected, but it just seems like too much of a coincidence, right? For it to just be a coincidence. But John Harbaugh, he was in Atlanta this weekend. He did an interview, right? The Atlanta Falcons announced that they have completed the interview with John Harbaugh. Not that he's even scheduled, they completed it. So it happened over the weekend. I think this is a curious weekend for that to happen, and a curious location for that to happen. I don't know what it means for him taking the Atlanta job, but I view Atlanta similar to Cleveland. It's a fine landing spot if you don't really think that any team really has a realistic shot at quarterback anytime soon. Probably, I don't know, Atlanta and Cleveland, I would say, are pretty similar, except for Cleveland has the big star on defense. They have like a all-world player on defense. I don't know if Atlanta has anybody that quality. They have really good players, but nobody of the Myles Garrett caliber, right, on the roster. The Browns do have that. And John Harbaugh, being the Ravens coach, might have an extra attraction to the Myles Garrett factor of this all. But anyways, I find that interesting, right, because he has to do work on these quarterbacks. The Raiders' job is available. The Raiders are clearly interested in him. If you want to know where I think John Harbaugh ends up at the end of the day, I think the Raiders makes the most sense for him, because what John Harbaugh provides you is stability, because he has credibility, right? Like, that's the number one thing that John Harbaugh is going to bring, because he's won a Super Bowl, because he's been a successful coach for 18 years. You are going to get buy-in from your roster when he shows up. You are going to get buy-in from the coaching staff while he's there. You aren't going to have to worry about that kind of stuff. And for a franchise that's fired a lot of coaches recently, that really needs to bet on some stability and is probably going to take a quarterback number 1 overall this year, you want that stability. John Harbaugh has the credibility with ownership, because he has had a lot of success before, to where it's not going to be easy to fire him after a couple of years, right? Like, you're going to have to give John Harbaugh time. You're going to have that freedom to give John Harbaugh time, and the fan base isn't going to want John Harbaugh fired because he struggles in 1 year or 2 years. They're going to give him time to fail on his own or to succeed on his own. So the Raiders' job, I think, makes the most sense for him. There's a pathway to a quarterback. They need him. He needs them. The question is, do they have the cash? Right? I don't imagine it's a problem, but we got to remember the Raiders are a cash-poor organization. The Raiders are the organization that, because they signed a coach to a $20 million contract, they couldn't keep Khalil Mack. Like, I don't underrate the fact that the Raiders are still a dysfunctional franchise, especially when it comes to money, and a cash-poor franchise at that. But I think John should probably end up with the Raiders. That makes the most sense to me. Now, let's jump to Cleveland, right? Because again, I said something right before the break. Opportunity cost. Here's my fear: that the Browns stay hooked on this Harbaugh thing, right? And they stay in it to the bitter end. Similar to the Deshaun Watson thing, right? Where Deshaun had a whole process, right? You had to get into one round, and then you got into a second round, and then you got into a third round, and then he narrowed it down and then brought Cleveland back, and then he ended up in Cleveland. Let's say that this Harbaugh thing is a similar process. Well, that's all going to happen while the other candidates that are available are going to be interviewing, are going to be taking jobs, are going to be moving forward with their plan, right? And if the Browns decide that they want to get all in on this Harbaugh thing and join the dog and pony show for Harbaugh, while understanding that they don't really have the highest odds in getting him, there's a chance here that could backfire tremendously. Do I think John Harbaugh could be a good head coach hire? Yes. Do I think John Harbaugh is such a good hire that it's worth potentially cutting yourself off of maybe 40 to 50% of the field right now? No, I don't think that's the case, right? If John Harbaugh really wants your job and is really willing to take the job and not just consider you and not do a whole dog and pony show for you to bring him in, then sure, we can bring in John Harbaugh. That'd be fine. But if John Harbaugh insists on this being like a month-long process or this whole extravagant thing, and you're going to lose a lot of opportunity to hire somebody else if he doesn't want to take the job, ultimately, then I think you're wasting your time and you're not making the franchise any better, right? I don't want the Browns to get so obsessed with bringing in this big fish, right? And for a lot of people, John Harbaugh is the great white buffalo. If you know what that is a reference to in the comment section, shout it out in the comments. But, you know, for a lot of people, he's the great white buffalo, right? He is the big fish in the pond, the mythical catch for Browns fans. They've been dreaming about this for 10 years. I'm not going to convince anybody who loves John Harbaugh and has wanted to hire him for the last 10 years to get off of that. Like they've been wanting to do this since I've been in high school, right? Like they love John Harbaugh. And if you commit so much to getting John and you don't get him, what are you going to be left with? More than likely, the same kind of thing that happened to the Browns when they got obsessed with Chip Kelly. Do you remember that? If you're a Browns fan of a certain age, my age or older, or you could be even a little younger and remember this, the Browns got really obsessed with the ideal of getting Chip Kelly. When Chip Kelly was like a big hot product. This isn't like Ohio State offensive coordinator Chip Kelly or fired offensive coordinator Chip Kelly. This is back when Chip Kelly was at Oregon the first time. He was a hot candidate, as hot as they come. The Browns were obsessed with getting Chip Kelly. And correct me if I'm wrong, but that was one of the first coaches searches that Jimmy Haslam was a part of. Let me double check this and see when he took the job in Philly. 2013. So yeah, this is after Haslam owned the team. So This was like Haslam's big fish that he wanted to get, right? You know, he's a new owner. He wants to make a big splash. Chip Kelly's coming from Oregon. He's leaving the job at Oregon. He's going to take a job in the NFL. And the Browns, they invest so much in trying to get Chip Kelly. They do a full court press on Chip Kelly. And then you hear that the Browns and Chip Kelly are closing in on a deal. I mean, it got basically reported by, I believe, Tony Grossi, of all people, that the Browns and Chip Kelly had agreed to a deal. And then about 12 hours later, it was announced that Chip Kelly was going to become the Philadelphia Eagles head coach. So not only did the Browns kind of embarrass themselves, right, which isn't that big of a deal, right? Who cares if the Browns embarrass themselves again if they're swinging at John Harbaugh? That's not my big concern. My big concern is what happened in the 2013 season, because the Browns missed out on Chip Kelly. They put all their chips and money and investment in Chip Kelly. He did not take the job. So you know what that meant? The Browns had to hire somebody to be the head coach. And they hired Robert Shazinski, who lasted a year before he was fired and replaced with the hot candidate, Mike Pettin, which is to say the Browns hired an interim head coach and then fired him to hire another interim head coach, essentially. And Mike Pettin, who wasn't really highly sought after. The Browns want to get a highly sought after head coaching candidate until, ironically enough, Hugh Jackson in 2016. That is what I mean by opportunity cost. If you go all in on John Harbaugh, I think you have to be sure that you're one of his top teams in consideration, and not like you're one of 5 teams. I mean, you have to be sure that this is going to come down to you or somebody else if you go all in on John Harbaugh and you go in on bringing him in. Because if you don't get John Harbaugh and you go all in on this Harbaugh thing, this coaching search, which I think they've done a decent job with so far, I like the candidates that they're bringing in. It feels well thought out. It feels like they're bringing in people with good reputations, or at least people who you can see a pathway for success for them here. If they throw all of that work out the window to go chase this great white buffalo in John Harbaugh, then all of a sudden this goes from a decent search to a straight up disaster in another wasted year of Myles Garrett's career, which I don't think anybody wants. So that's what the Browns have to practice. I think the Browns need to practice some self-awareness, right? Like, I understand that John might keep you in the process and considered, but I would not hold up the entire head coaching search process for John Harbaugh because, one, I have questions about where he is as a coach right now and his fit with Cleveland. I don't know if he is what Cleveland needs at this current moment. 2, I have questions about whether he even wants to take the Cleveland job. It just doesn't make sense for him to want to take this job, or at least overwhelming sense for him to want to take this job. And 3, what is John Harbaugh when he doesn't have a quarterback? He spent the last, almost 10 years with Lamar Jackson being a top 3 quarterback, and they still didn't reach a level of success that they felt like was getting the most out of where the Ravens were, to the point to where they fired John Harbaugh for that. So if he's not getting the most out of a top 3 quarterback, if he's not getting the most out of a roster people have thought were Super Bowl contenders, where is he in the position to get the most out of with Cleveland? Like, is this going to be another situation where some big name comes in to run the Browns and gets treated like a savior and he doesn't do jack shit? You know, this happened with Mike Holmgren back in the day, where Mike was supposed to fix the Browns and we're finally going to have the right guy in charge. And all Mike Holmgren did is, rest in peace, hire Jim Hackert and Pat Shermer. You know, Browns ended up being pretty mediocre. So That's kind of where I'm sitting. Are the Browns self-aware enough to handle this John Harbaugh thing correctly? Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. I have my concerns. Here's another thing to keep in mind with John Harbaugh. Look at what he's been asked to do his entire career, right? And this is no slight to John. Again, if you're in a situation where you need a coach to do what John Harbaugh has demonstrated that he could do successfully for 18 years, you go and get you John Harbaugh. The Browns are not in that situation though, right? The Browns don't need to build from scratch. They have some things built, but other things do need to be reconstructed entirely from scratch here. I think the offense, not from scratch, but pretty much from scratch here. Has John Harbaugh demonstrated himself as somebody who is well equipped to navigate those kind of things, right? Like for all the experience he has in 18 years, the Ravens have not really been in a position where he's had to build it from the bottom up, right? Granted, the Ravens haven't had amazing offenses while he's there, which is another conversation you might want to have. But, you know, he's always been dealing with at least a half full deck there in Baltimore. And this would be a completely different situation for him. Does this make sense for him? Does this make sense for Cleveland? I want you to think of Jim Harbaugh as a candidate, not as a savior. I think a lot of people are caught up in the ideal of John Harbaugh. I think I said Jim earlier, my bad, of John Harbaugh, but not really locked into the reality of John, which is John has things that he's good at. John has things that he's bad at. John has things that he has struggled with. John has things that he hasn't. John has things that he has a lot of experience with. John has things that he doesn't. John also has things that he has a lot of experience with that are questionable, right? Like if you want somebody to come in here and figure out wide receiver, I don't know if John Harbaugh is your guy. Go look at his history with developing wide receivers or with his coordinators in developing wide receivers. It's not really a great history out there in Baltimore. Again, there is this impression that John Harbaugh is going to save us. That is dangerous because that's not who John Harbaugh is. Couldn't John Harbaugh be successful in Cleveland? Yes. But if you just give the entire organization to John Harbaugh, I don't think that's going to be a successful project. I think that's going to be a failure because that's not who John is. John is somebody who has mastered figuring out his role as just a head coach. He is somebody who could facilitate and get things to certain people. He is not somebody who runs the whole show by himself. And I would be fearful that Cleveland would be tempted to get him to run the whole show himself. And I don't think that's what Harbaugh has demonstrated himself to be good at. Your opinion might differ from mine. This is my opinion I've built up from not just watching the John Harbaugh from a Browns perspective, but listening to Raven fans and people who cover the Ravens through the various shows I have where I cover the entire AFC North since 2019, right? Like I feel like I have a pretty complete picture on what they liked about John and what they didn't. And that makes me a little bit more hesitant, right? I don't think that the Ravens just fired him for no reason. And I think we're just kind of assuming that we're getting like prime John here, and I don't know if that's the John we're getting. So that's my thoughts on this whole thing. Let me know what you think. Y'all have a great day. Have a better night. Peace.